You start the book in 2017 with Hugh Hefner being buried next to Marilyn Monroe. And in some sense, they had a lot in common. They were a part of the sexual revolution, albeit in different ways. I mean, Marilyn Monroe's the pinup, the actor. Hugh Hefner is the kind of more of the businessman who founded Playboy. They both were born in 1926. So, again, they have some things in common. But what I found most interesting were the differences. And you used those differences to kind of frame the argument of your book. Could you explain how these two people, Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner, kind of set up what you're trying to get at in the case against the sexual revolution?
I think what they demonstrate, because as you say, their lives in some senses were so similar. They were also born in the same year as the Queen. I didn't realize
Oh,
that until
I didn't know
recently.
that. That's crazy.
It's a very different life course. But um back to Monroe and Hefner. Um yeah, so similar in so many ways. And they never actually met, but they did interact, in the sense that, to put it mildly, because Hefner printed um Monroe's nude photos without her consent in the first issue of Playboy, and also featured her as the cover girl. So they were sort of deeply intertwined in that sense. But also that I think that they demonstrate very beautifully the way that the sexual revolution had a very different impact on men than it did on women, on some types of men. So I argue in the book that the real winners from the sexual revolution are not women. They are men like Hugh Hefner, men who are attractive, high status, very driven. I mean, he had this seemingly insatiable sexual appetite, always had this kind of harem around him of young blonde women who will stay the same age even as he grew old. And that's how he died. He never grew up. He was this sort of um deranged hypersexual Peter Pan who refused to ever acquire, you know family adult responsibility. um and he seemed to enjoy himself a great deal, and he was a great defender of the sexual revolution. I mean, the eulogists when he died, many of them represented him as being this sort of unexpected feminist ally, because he pushed for the pill to be made available to unmarried women, and he pushed for the decriminalization of abortion. He didn't push for any of those things for the sake of women, though of course they were in his own interest, because it was, a means of making even more women sexually available to him and to men like him. um Whereas Monroe obviously lives a very tragic life in many ways. We know surprisingly little about her childhood, actually, but we do know that she was in foster care. She was probably sexually abused. She was a victim of domestic violence in later life, and, of course, died as a result of substance abuse, and suffered from a lot of mental illness. And that is actually a very, very common story among women who become sex symbols, whose sexuality becomes their defining characteristic in public life. I write a little bit in the book about some other examples of icons of apparent sexual liberation who have been destroyed by fame. And I would argue that actually the experience that Monroe had, obviously an extreme one, gives us an amazing insight into the impact that that sexual liberation has on women. In that, um, in its most extreme form, I think that it destroys women. Honestly, the what is often portrayed in the popular narrative as a historical process of liberation from old oppressive norms. That's the narrative that I'm trying to challenge in the book. And I argue that what we should really be understanding the sexual revolution as, in fact, is, yes, a rejection of old norms, the good and the bad, but also, more importantly, when those norms are lifted, what we see happen is that women are increasingly encouraged to behave more like men sexually. That Hugh Hefner is set up as an aspirational example for men and for women. And the typical preferences of women when it comes to sex are disregarded, and women are encouraged to override their instincts in a way that I think is extraordinarily harmful.
There's so much in there, and let's
Yeah.
unpack a little bit of that over the next few minutes.
Do you feel politically homeless?
Join the club.
Both parties are becoming more tribal, and neither fully represent the values of Jesus. Christians need a path forward that leaves partisanship behind.
That's why we wrote Truth Over Tribe, pledging allegiance to the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. Together, we can end tribalism.
Pre-order the book on Amazon, and let's start a movement.
But before we get too much further, let's stay with Hefner for just another moment. In the book, you reference a 2009 New York Times article. So Hefner is 83 years old at the time, and he's quoted, or here's a quote from the article. It says, "Mr. Hefner will concede that there are dark consequences of what he helped set into motion, but said, quote, it's a small price to pay for personal freedom." So you're saying in the book that yes, the case for the sexual revolution liberated someone, but it was male sexuality, not women. In some sense, it seems like the sexual revolution overpromised and underdelivered. At least for women, it did. But that's not the common narrative. The common narrative is that the sexual revolution was good for women. But even here in this 2009 article, it says that he concedes, that Hefner concedes that there are dark consequences. What are some of those dark consequences that came in pursuit of personal freedom?
So Hefner died. When Hefner died, he had seen the transformation of the porn industry, partly as a result of his, entrepreneurial behavior from him and from other men, but more importantly because of the internet. And I think that a lot of what I write about in the book, in relation to porn and things like dating apps and the real kind of sexual alienation that I think we see going on among both men and women, is the ideology of the sexual revolution added to technology. So the pill obviously originally that's the big technology shock that sets all of this in motion. But the internet is the other huge one. And it's almost, I think it's difficult to overstate quite how dark the porn industry is. And quite how much it has, some of what porn does is that it takes fantasies that human beings have probably always had, mostly but not exclusively men, and makes them visible in a way that has appalled many feminists, for instance, to go onto these sites and to see the depth of misogyny within the porn industry. But I think the other thing that it does is it doesn't just reflect people's darkest desires, it also embeds them. The way that the sites are designed is to arouse a human animal as efficiently as possible. It's all about those kind of very, very basic instincts, but then also to suggest more and more extreme forms of stimulation, and to provide this kind of dopamine feedback loop reinforced by orgasm, which rewards these impulses, introduces new and more extreme versions of them, and ultimately, for the people who become really addicted to porn, warp their sexuality to the extent that they can't even have real sexual relationships offline with real people. There was I think it is becoming increasingly possible to say, even among liberals, that the porn industry is not good. It's difficult to find really, really wholehearted defenders of the industry. What you're more likely to hear, though, from liberals is something like, yes, the porn industry isn't good, but this is because sexual liberation hasn't actually been accomplished yet. And we haven't successfully educated people.
We need more freedom, more porn,
we
more.
need more feminism, porn. You know, we just need to replace this unpleasant content with more wholesome content, and we need to be educating people and educating young people about, you know, the criticism I often hear of porn, which I find to be slightly strange, is that it's unrealistic. I think, well, it's, I mean, so is a lot of entertainment. The unrealistic element of it is not inherently bad. What's bad about it is that it's like loveless, hateful, aggressive, all of this kind of stuff, and that it's very clearly training young minds to expect sex to be that way. I don't think that the answer to that is education. I don't think that the answer to that is just to introduce more feminist porn, as if that's going to outcompete the other kinds. I think that's an absurd idea. I think that we really need to be looking at the very root of this and saying, we survived as a species for 200,000 years without an online porn industry. Why is this a human right? And most feminists on the left are absolutely not willing to have that conversation, I think, particularly in America. But it is becoming increasingly obvious quite how harmful porn is. There was New York Times investigation a couple of years ago now, which was very, very, very influential. The Children of MindGeek was the headline, because MindGeek is this umbrella organization that owns a lot of the major porn platforms, and featured interviews with young people in particular who had been negatively affected by porn. And the young woman who was used as the main example and whose photograph was shared with the piece, she had been sexual images of her being put on Pornhub when she was, I think, 14, and had been described as such. There was absolutely there's no ambiguity about her age in the content, and had been viewed very many times. Pornhub had profited from those views. Advertisers on the page had also profited from those views. She asked them to take it down. They didn't. Their safeguarding procedures are laughably poor. Some would argue deliberately poor, because it's not in their interest to be removing this content. And this young woman ended up addicted to heroin and living out of her car as a result of this experience. She is now involved in a legal case against MindGeek and against Visa, who she alleges knowingly profited from the distribution of child sexual abuse images. So I think that there is a reckoning happening with as Hefner described it, the dark consequences of the sexual revolution. And I think that most of us are in agreement that those consequences are real. The question is, what is their cause and what is their cure?
And it's not only pornography. I was reading this morning research that shows in the last 60 years, women have gained freedom and opportunity, but their self-reported happiness has declined, at least in the United States. That women with more sexual partners have more mental health issues, which takes us back to Marilyn Monroe, who dies of substance abuse overdoses at age 36. So some of the dark consequences are these young women who are dating men who are addicted to porn and who therefore are being mistreated or being demeaned, thought of as objects. But here's the deal. What matters now in our culture is consent. And as long as everybody gives their consent to pornography or what have you, it's supposed to be okay. You argue in the book that consent isn't enough. Like, it's a minimum. We can't have less than consent, but it's not enough to build a sexual ethic on. I think that surprises a lot of people, because that's what we've all been told. As long as two people are consenting, they can do anything they want, and it is none of anybody else's business. Help us understand why consent isn't enough.
So I'd say that there's a very large grey area between consensual sex and good sex, which meets a legal threshold, but leaves one or both parties feeling distressed. It was interesting during Me Too that a lot of the examples of distress and sexual misbehavior that came out did not actually miss that that legal threshold, like what was done was legal, and no one really claimed otherwise. But it was also wrong, and it also left women in particular feeling dreadful and feeling abused. And it's very difficult to talk about that kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it, injustice? Misbehavior sounds far too trivial. Those kind of wrongs in the language of consent, because consent is this almost very legalistic language, and also very binary. It's either non-consensual or it's consensual. Whereas a lot of what was described during Me Too was behavior that could probably be more accurately described as ungentlemanly. And that's the kind of vocabulary that liberal feminists are completely allergic to because it's so old-fashioned. And I think also because it's sort of the liberal feminism is very uncomfortable with the idea of men and women being different, right? On a physical level, on a psychological level, the idea that our social roles ought to be different. They clearly are different in our society and indeed in every other society, but the goal is supposed to be eventually erasing that difference and having kind of true equality. Whereas if you say commit to an idea of gentlemanliness or chivalry or any of these old-fashioned words, what you're saying implicitly is that men ought to be held to a different standard, that there is a particular kind of masculinity which is good and aspirational, and that, as I would argue, the fact that men are bigger and stronger than women, the fact that men don't get pregnant, the fact that men are more likely to be driven towards casual sex and having sex with someone early on, it's much more likely in general to be the man who's pushing to want to have sex on the first date, not the women, just in terms of our natural differences in sexuality, which are average differences, but which are also quite marked at the population level. All of these things mean, I think, that the burden is on men to restrain themselves, to behave in a chivalrous manner. And what you're seeing in Me Too is men not doing that. And this probably shouldn't surprise us, given that we've got a sexual culture now that is incapable of talking about this.